All right, so you want to talk about a wild request for a deep dive. Someone wants to know about Canadians in war,
Uh-huh.
and specifically how they went from, like, sorry, eh, to storm the trenches in the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
You've dug up some seriously wild stories for this one, and I gotta say, I am ready to get into it.
Yeah. Let's just say the whole nice Canadian thing. You got to kind of, rethink that a little when you look at their military history,
Right.
especially in the world wars.
That's exactly what's got me so intrigued. It's the contrast, you know? Like, we picture peacekeepers, right?
Yeah.
But then you hear about this whole other side. So where do we even begin to unpack this?
I think World War One. That's the turning point.
Okay.
That's where Canada's military image really shifts. Before that, I mean, on the world stage, militarily, nobody really knew them.
They weren't really on the map like that.
Not really, no. But by the end of World War One, let's just say the Germans knew who they were dealing with.
See, that's what I don't get. Feared. That's not the first word that springs to mind with Canadians, right? So how do we go from point A to, like, full-on stormtroopers?
You got to remember what trench warfare was like in World War One.
Yeah.
Brutal doesn't even cut it.
Right. It was just constant.
Constant shelling, mud everywhere you looked,
Mhm.
poison gas always a threat. It created this intensity,
Mm.
and it forged a different kind of soldier.
Okay, so we're talking Canadians, known for being, polite, and suddenly they have a reputation as some of the most ruthless fighters out there.
It sounds crazy, but yeah. The Germans even started calling them stormtroopers. Wild colonials, too. And trust me, those weren't compliments.
No, I don't imagine so, but it seems like that reputation came from somewhere.
Right.
They were effective, though, right? Like, brutally effective in close combat.
They were. It's almost hard to believe the change, and it's all coming from, well, let's face it, trench raiding. That stuff was terrifying. Even just hearing about it now. It's
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
yeah.
Just the thought of it, right?
The darkness, the tight spaces, and then suddenly, bam. These figures coming out of nowhere. Canadians were masters of stealth. Blackened faces. They even wore rubber gloves.
Rubber gloves? What, like they were about to do some cleaning instead of a raid?
It was all about being silent,
Mm-hmm.
but deadly.
Mm.
They used a lot of, well, handmade weapons. Spiked clubs, knives, brass knuckles.
Oh, so we're talking up close and personal.
Up close and personal. They were ruthlessly efficient. They'd use anything hand-to-hand, pipe bombs, grenade catapults, anything to gain an advantage, and it worked. There were stories of them pushing a kilometer past enemy lines just because they were so fast, so terrifying.
A whole kilometer.
Oh.
That really says it all, doesn't it? But it's not like they were just an unorganized force of, like, rage, right? They had, like, the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and that's, like, a massive deal in Canada.
Huge. Vimy Ridge is more than a battle. It's like a symbol. It's Canada becoming a real military power on the world stage. But to get there, it was intense. The months before the battle, they launched 55 raids. 55.
55 raids. It sounds like they were sending a message, you know? Were there any that were particularly, well, I don't want to say intense, but...
There was one in March of 1917.
Yeah.
Over 1,300 soldiers. These guys were getting hit with gas attacks constantly. Almost half were killed or wounded.
You're kidding. That's almost impossible to imagine.
And even with that, one group from the raid managed to clear 450 meters of the German trench line. The grit these soldiers had.
It's just, like, off the charts.
Yeah.
But that leads us to a darker part of this. We have to talk about the accounts of Canadian soldiers killing prisoners of war and, like, not always in the heat of battle.
Yeah, that is a disturbing part of their history, for
Yeah.
sure. We can't shy away from it. These are documented cases. Canadians executing prisoners. And in some situations, it looks like superior officers were actually encouraging it.
I mean, as a host, I'm supposed to have some witty remark here, but that's just chilling. It really makes you rethink the whole nice Canadian image.
Right. There are theories about it. Being in the trenches, the fear, the loss. That could wear down anyone's moral compass.
Right.
Some of them were convinced that every prisoner was just one less mouth to feed. It was about survival.
That whole us versus them mentality.
Yeah.
But taken to a terrifying extreme.
Exactly. And then there's revenge. You have soldiers who lost friends, and they're consumed by grief, rage. And it's often directed at enemy prisoners.
There are some seriously chilling quotes in these accounts. I read one from a lieutenant, and he's talking about how his men found this group of German soldiers. After a brutal machine gun attack, the Germans are surrendering, hands in the air, begging for their lives. And the Canadians just...
Open fire.
It's difficult to process, to square that image with what we think we know about Canadians.
It's tough.
And it gets even worse. There's another story about a Canadian soldier who and this is just cold. He drops a live grenade into the pocket of a surrendering German.
It's a stark reminder, I think. War brings out the worst in people, no matter where they're from. It's, not exactly a side of history we talk about a lot, especially given what happened, later. Like, you have the Christmas truce, right?
Right.
1914.
Yeah, 1914.
Both sides just setting aside the war, even if it's just for a few hours. This moment of, like, shared humanity.
It's incredible, right? This glimmer of hope in the middle of all that darkness. Makes you wonder, though, did the Canadians, with their reputation for, well, let's say forceful trench tactics, were they ever part of that kind of truce?
It's like they went out of their way to avoid it. There's this story about a Canadian sergeant.
Yeah.
Christmas Day, he uses a machine gun to kill 2 German soldiers who were literally just exchanging holiday greetings with some Canadians.
On Christmas? Are you serious? Talk about a mood killer. It's hard to even imagine that.
And it wasn't just a one-time thing. There was another case. Canadians threw cans of corned beef into a German trench.
Okay.
And when the Germans called out for more, figuring it was a real gesture,
they tossed grenades instead. Yeah, I'm sensing a theme here, and it's not exactly holiday cheer.
it was pretty grim. Seemed like the Canadians were dead set against that whole live and let live thing that was happening in other parts of the Western Front. And there are theories about why. One is that they were really marked by that story, the whole crucified Canadian thing.
The what now?
It was this rumor, probably not any true, about a Canadian officer crucified to a barn door by the Germans.
Oh, wow.
Whether it was real or not, the story spread like wildfire through the troops. And that fueled some intense desire for revenge, let me tell you.
So let's remember the Alamo and more like a really, really dark, twisted version of it.
Yeah, pretty violent.
I mean, in a horrible way, it makes sense, but still.
And then you have what happened at the Second Battle of Ypres, 1915. That's where they got hit with the first major German poison gas attack. Thousands of Canadians were killed or wounded, left a scar,
Yeah.
physically and psychologically.
I mean, to go through something that horrific,
Yeah.
it would change anyone.
A lot of people say those experiences, the rumors, the gas attacks, it all bred this anger, resentment. And that came out in their brutal tactics.
Right.
Whatever the reason. By the end of World War I, Canada had gone from being practically invisible to one of the most well-respected and feared armies out there.
Feared and respected, yeah. Sums it up pretty well, honestly. Which I guess leads us to World War II, right? I mean, it's not like they faded back into obscurity after all that.
By World War II, the Canadians, they weren't some mystery anymore. The Germans had learned firsthand what they were capable of a generation earlier, and the stormtroopers were back. Everybody knew what that meant this time.
Wait, stormtroopers? As in, like, the elite German shock troops from World War II?
Yep.
You're saying they took the term the Germans used for the Canadians in World War I.
It's something else, isn't it?
That's wild.
Maybe they didn't mean to do it, but
Okay.
it's telling. That's how much of an impact they had made. Even a nickname, something meant to scare you, it became synonymous with, like, the best of the best, elite fighting force.
That is... Honestly, when you think about it, that's kind of chilling, Like a dark mirror or something. But nicknames aside, what about World War II? What moments really cemented that reputation? Because I know they weren't exactly sitting this one out.
We got to talk about D-Day.
Okay.
Specifically, Juno Beach.
Right.
This wasn't just some side mission,
Yeah.
Juno Beach, that was one of the toughest landing zones.
Yeah.
Heavily fortified, heavily defended.
And the Canadians were sent straight into the thick of it.
They were.
Wow. I'm looking at the details here. It's intense. 3,000 Canadians charging Dreamin' pillboxes under heavy fire the first wave of the attack.
And they did not let up. By the end of the day, they secured their objective on the beach, but they'd also gone further inland than any other Allied force that landed on D-Day.
The only unit to achieve all of their D-Day objectives that first day.
Yeah.
It's, incredible. And kind of terrifying, knowing what they had to go through.
For sure. Speaks to their training, their discipline.
Yeah.
But also, I think, that same ferocious determination we saw in World War I wasn't a fluke.
Relentless.
Absolutely.
And not afraid to push the limits, clearly. Which I think brings us to another World War II story that deserves some attention. The Devils Brigade. Even the name sounds like something out of a movie.
The first Special Service Force. Joint Canadian and American unit. These guys were legendary. Tough, resourceful, and they scared the hell out of the Germans.
Okay, see, even the name Devils Brigade, you don't get stuck with a name like that unless you've earned it, right?
No.
What made them so formidable?
We're talking about men pushed to the absolute limit.
Hmm.
Just to get selected, you had to go through this brutal selection process
Hmm.
designed to weed out anyone who wasn't, like, insanely tough, mentally, physically.
Wow.
And the training.
I can't even imagine.
100-mile marches, fully loaded with gear, weapons training, hand-to-hand demolitions, mastering every weapon they could get their hands on. They were adaptable, they were relentless, and they were deadly.
It sounds almost superhuman. What's the story that really sums up what the Devils Brigade was all about?
Their assault on Monte la Defensa in Italy.
Okay.
Legendary. This was a mountaintop fortress, considered basically impossible to capture. The Allies had thrown everything at it, suffered heavy losses.
I read that they fired 200,000 artillery shells at it. It was called Million Dollar Hill. Not exactly what I'd call an easy target.
Not at all. But the Devils Brigade found a way. Under cover of darkness, they scaled this cliff face, talking practically vertical, carrying 60 pounds of gear.
They claimed that, knowing what was waiting at the top. Talk about guts.
They were masters of surprise, caught the Germans completely off guard, fierce hand-to-hand combat in the dead of night, and they won.
A force 10 times smaller than any of the previous attempts managed to take the mountain, and they did it in a matter of hours.
The Devils Brigade. They weren't just tough. They were innovative, adaptable. They thought outside the box, and they did not give up. In a war where your willpower often meant the difference between, well, victory and defeat, those qualities, they were everything.
It's another example of Canadians playing a key role in a victory that a lot of people thought was impossible. So we've gone from nice Canadians to stormtroopers to scaling mountains in the middle of the night. I'm starting to think there's even more to this story than I realized. It really makes you think twice, you know, about underestimating Canada. Maybe nice doesn't even begin to describe it.
It's funny, right? Because you have that image, the peaceful image.
Right.
And then you see what they're capable of on the battlefield, like this ferocity, this, I don't know, this willingness to just push further, endure more than anyone expects.
It makes you wonder, was it just the circumstances, like the sheer brutality of war? Did that bring that side out of them? Or is it deeper than that? Is it about being Canadian?
Yeah.
Something in their identity that comes out under pressure.
It's a good question. I mean, think about it. You've got the Canadian wilderness, that whole spirit of resilience, long winters, vast distances.
All right.
It's not hard to see how that could translate to the battlefield even.
Like they had this, I don't know, this well of strength they could tap into, and they didn't even know it was there until they were pushed that far.
Exactly. And you can't forget, for a country known for peacekeeping, Canada's got a long military history. The Boer War, both world wars, and of course, more recently, all the peacekeeping missions.
Yeah.
They always step up,
Yeah.
even when it takes them to some pretty dark places.
So maybe it's not even about nice or not nice. Maybe it's more, I don't know, like they're not looking for a fight, but if you back them into a corner.
They'll come out swinging.
Yeah. And you might not like what you see.
That quiet strength, it's powerful. A sense of duty, a willingness to fight for what they believe in, even when things are absolutely awful.
Which, in a way, makes their story even more incredible, right? Like they weren't out there starting conflicts. But when they were called on, they rose to the occasion with a level of tenacity that's just
Remarkable.
totally. It makes you rethink everything you thought you knew.
And that's why we love history.
Right.
Challenges what we think we know.
Yep.
Makes us confront those assumptions. Because the world is complicated, right?
Absolutely. It makes you wonder if war can bring out those unexpected sides in a whole nation. What about us as individuals? Like, what's that potential inside each of us, the good and the bad? Just waiting for the right moment, the right pressure?
That's a question for the ages.
Right.
And maybe the point isn't even to find an answer. Maybe it's about, just sitting with how complex it all is.
It's about the journey, exploring those contradictions, which is why we do these deep dives. And I think it's safe to say we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today.
I have.
We've gone to some dark places, looked at some incredible acts of courage, resilience, all to try to understand this fascinating paradox of Canadian military history.
And like any good deep dive, we're just scratching the surface, really.
Always mortifying.
There are tons of other stories to uncover, other ways of looking at this.
Which is why we leave it to you, our listeners. Keep digging. What surprised you the most? What questions are still bouncing around in your head? Because the best discoveries are the ones we make for ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.